Hey, so we've recently introduced a new dialog element into the editor, and there's a bunch of cool things you can do with it. So today, we'll be running through all the different ways you can customize it, as well as some example use cases and some general tips and tricks. So let's jump in. You can find the dialog element in the Add panel underneath the Dialog tab. Now in the Add panel, there's 3 variations, but they're all the same underlying dialog component, just with different styling and properties applied for different use cases. So for now, I'll drag the modal variation onto the page. Now inside the dialog element, you'll find trigger, content, and overlay elements by default. We'll run through in detail what these do shortly, but for now, I'm just going to make the text white so we can see what we're working with. So for editing purposes, we can click onto the dialog element, press toggle on the right-hand side, and now we can view the content. Now, as you can see, the dialog has various different properties that you can change. We'll run through each one, but let's start with the first, and perhaps one of the most important, the type. And for the type, there's 3 options: none, modal, or sheet. If you choose none, the dialog element will be unpositioned. If you choose modal, you'll be presented with different positioning options. So for the side options, you can choose left, center, right, or custom, and position it accordingly. And similarly, you can choose the alignment. So top, center, bottom, or again custom, where you again can choose the specific position. And finally, for the type options, you have a sheet. The key difference between a sheet and a modal is that when you're using a sheet and the side is top or bottom, it will take up the entire available screen width. And if the side is left or right, it will take up the entire available screen height. That's the key difference between a sheet and a modal. Now the animation properties are relatively self-explanatory. The animation select controls the type of animation. If you have slide in selected here, you'll have a direction option, which controls the direction the animation enters from. Animation duration, which controls the duration of the animation, and animation easing, which controls the easing applied to the animation. Unfortunately for now, the animation only applies to the animation in, not the animation out, and we'll be looking to add this in the future. Now the prevent scrolling property controls whether or not the page itself is scrollable while the dialog is open. For example, if I was to close the dialog and add a new section to the page, and give the section a large height, to now reach the section on our page, I have to scroll. And since on the dialog we currently have prevent scrolling on, if I open the dialog, I'm unable to scroll the page and reach our new section. However, if I now turn prevent scrolling off and open the dialog, I'm able to scroll the page. We then have the escape key to close property, and if toggled on, the user can press the escape key on their keyboard to close the dialog. And we then have properties related to the trigger. Now these require a bit more of a detailed explanation, and we'll start with the trigger click opens property. To illustrate this, I'll hide our dialog, turn trigger click opens to off, put it into preview, and click the contents of the trigger. And as we can see, nothing happens. And so if I was to now turn the trigger click opens property to on and click the contents of our trigger, we can see that it opens the dialog. And the reason for this is that we have the trigger click opens property to on, and this text element is inside the trigger flexbox. And for the trigger property itself, this controls whether or not the trigger flexbox exists. So if I turn this to off, we can see the trigger flexbox is no longer there. And if there is no trigger, well then you might be wondering, how do we actually open the dialog? Well, we can show and hide the dialog by using workflows. To show this, I'll add a button on the page and give it some styling. I'll add a workflow to the button, choose the execute component action module, choose the dialog, and now we have 3 available actions: toggle, open, and close. Toggle opens the dialog if it's currently closed, and vice versa. Open opens the dialog, and close closes the dialog. And so if I choose the toggle workflow and click our button, we can see it toggles the display of the dialog. And finally, for the available properties, we have overlay and overlay click closes. When the dialog is visible and we have the overlay property set to on, we can see we have this overlay element. And if we wish, we can directly change the styling of this overlay element to change things like its background color. For the overlay click closes property, if this is set to on, when the dialog is open and you click the overlay, then this will close the dialog. And if it's set to off, then clicking the overlay when the dialog is open will not automatically close the dialog. For the overlay property itself, this controls whether or not the overlay element exists. And so if I turn the overlay property to off, we can see we no longer have the overlay element, and we now have 2 additional properties. The first is click outside to close, and this operates similarly to the overlay click closes option. It's currently set to off, so when we click outside of the dialog, it does not automatically close the dialog. However, if we set this to on, then clicks outside of the dialog will automatically close the dialog. And when click outside to close is set to off, we have this additional property, prevent interaction outside. And this simply controls whether you can interact with elements outside the dialog when the dialog is open. With all of the properties now covered, let's run through some use cases. On my page, I have 3 dialogs: a modal dialog, a sheet dialog, and an issue alert dialog. Now this is just a dialog with the type modal, but certain styling has been applied to make it appear as an alert. For my detailed sheet dialog, I'm using this to show detailed information about an issue. So when I click on an issue, a sheet appears with enriched information about the issue. For my modal dialog, I have a Learn More text button in the bottom left corner that when pressed, opens a modal with more information about the page. And then finally, my issue alert dialog is triggered whenever I create a new issue. Now in all of these examples, the dialog's visibility is being controlled by component actions inside of workflows, but it's completely your choice whether or not you want to control them via workflows or via the native trigger. It ultimately depends on your use case and your preference. Now a great use case for WeWeb AI when you're working with dialogs is to generate their styling. Here, I've asked the AI to generate contents for an error modal and it gives a great output. And similarly here, I've asked it to generate the designs for a message sent confirmation alert. And if your styling requires changing the position, such as asking for the dialog to be a top bar, the AI can even correctly change not only the designs, but the properties of the dialog to correctly position and size it. Now something to be aware of is that by default, whenever the dialog is hidden, it is de-rendered. That means when it's hidden, you're unable to add things into the contents of the dialog. In order to adjust the contents, you must first make sure the dialog is visible, and then you'll be able to make the necessary adjustments. Another thing to be aware of is that there may be certain situations where you need to change the positioning of your dialog in the layout tree due to it being inside of flexboxes that have a certain position styling. For example here, I have a left side nav flexbox, and inside of this left side nav, I have a dialog element with a native trigger. So when I click the learn more text that's inside of this trigger, we can see the dialog, but it's incorrectly positioned. And the reason for this is the left side nav flexbox the dialog is inside has sticky positioning assigned. And so to resolve this, I can move the learn more text outside of the dialog, disable the trigger since we won't be using it, and move the dialog to be outside of the left side nav flexbox. Then, since we're no longer using the native trigger, to control the display of the dialog using the learn more text, I'll need to do so in a workflow. So now when we try this, we can see the dialog is positioned correctly, and this is because it no longer sits inside of that left side nav flexbox that had sticky positioning. Now one final thing to note is that elements inside of the dialog have direct access to the core 3 actions of the dialog: toggle, open, and close. Now these operate in the exact same way as those we saw in the execute component actions module. They just give you a very quick way to access the actions of whatever dialog the element is inside of. And so since we have the close action here, when we click the X icon that the workflow is set up on, it closes the dialog that it's inside of. So, hopefully you're now ready to get building with the new dialog element. If you would like anything written to refer back to, everything I've just covered is in our documentation. There'll be a link to it in the description. In the meantime, if you have any questions about how to best use the dialog element, feel free to post them on our community forums or join us in one of our live office hours sessions. Until next time, I'll catch you in the next one.